The brick crashed through my car window at exactly 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, sending glass shards across the passenger seat like a constellation of shattered stars. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I just sat there in the parking garage of my apartment building, watching a man with cold, dead eyes turn and walk away into the shadows, followed by my stepfather Rick's hunched, pathetic figure. The note wrapped around the brick was simple, written in blocky letters that suggested someone who wanted to disguise their handwriting drop the case, or next time it won't be the window. This was what my family had become. This was what my mother's greed had unleashed. And this was the moment I knew there was no turning back. But before I tell you how I got here, before I explain how a daughter could end up being threatened by mobsters because her own mother wanted to steal her inheritance, I need you to do something for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories of people who fought back against toxic families. And please leave a comment telling me if you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own survival. Your story matters too. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, to the day everything changed, though. I didn't fully understand it then. 3 months earlier, I stood in the gleaming marble lobby of the Boston County Courthouse, adjusting the collar of my charcoal gray suit. The fabric was expensive, purchased with my own money earned through years of grueling work as an assistant district attorney. I had a case to prepare for a domestic violence prosecution that required my full attention, but I'd received an urgent message that morning. My grandfather's lawyer needed to see me immediately regarding his estate. Grandpa Arthur had passed away 2 weeks prior, and while I was still drowning in grief, apparently there were legal matters that couldn't wait. I never expected to see her there. My mother, Sharon, stood near the information desk, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her blonde hair professionally styled in a way that screamed, "I'm important and you should know it." Next to her was Rick, her third husband, a man whose greatest accomplishment in life seemed to be perfecting the art of living off other people's money. The moment Sharon spotted me, her face transformed into something ugly, something that made several lawyers and courthouse staff turn to stare. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." Sharon's voice carried across the marble expanse, loud enough to echo, intentional enough to humiliate. Our little orphan girl, too busy destroying other families in court to visit her dying grandfather. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face neutral. Years of courtroom experience had taught me not to react to provocations even when they came from my own mother. I started to walk toward the elevator, hoping to avoid a scene. Rick stepped directly into my path, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath, even though it was barely 11 in the morning. His eyes traveled over my suit with contempt. "Playing dress up in your fancy lawyer costume. Don't forget where you came from, girl. Don't forget who raised you." The irony of that statement would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. Rick had been around for maybe 5 years of my life. He didn't raise me. He barely acknowledged my existence except when he needed money, which was often. Before I could respond, a door opened to my right, and Judge Reynolds emerged from his chambers. He was a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His gaze fell on me, then traveled to Sharon and Rick, and I saw his expression shift with recognition and what might have been concern. "Ms. Callahan," he said, his voice formal but not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you on this side of the courthouse. I assume you're here regarding your grandfather's estate." The change in Sharon's face was instantaneous and almost comical. The sneer melted away, replaced by shock, then something that looked like fear. Her mouth actually fell open. Rick's complexion went from ruddy to pale in seconds. "You're a prosecutor." Sharon's voice had lost all its venom, replaced by a disbelief so complete it was almost childlike. I met her eyes, those blue eyes that matched my own, and felt nothing but emptiness. "Yes, have been for 3 years, but you'd know that if you'd ever bothered to ask about my life." Judge Reynolds nodded to me politely and walked away, but the damage was done. Or rather, the revelation was made. I watched my mother's mind work, saw her recalculating, reassessing. Next to her, Rick looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Behind them, I noticed for the first time a sharp-dressed man in his 50s holding a leather briefcase. His eyes were intelligent, calculating, and he was studying me with the intensity of a predator who just realized his prey had claws. That must be Marcus Thorne, I thought. The lawyer Sharon and Rick had hired. His reputation preceded him. He was known for taking on inheritance disputes, always representing the aggrieved family members who felt they'd been cheated out of their rightful share. He won more often than he lost, which meant he was either very good or very ruthless. Probably both. The reading of the will took place that afternoon in a conference room at the law offices of Morrison and Associates. The room was all dark wood and leather chairs designed to convey both wealth and tradition. Sharon and Rick sat across from me, having clearly taken time to change into even more expensive outfits, as if dressing like they deserved millions would somehow make it true. Marcus Thorne sat beside them, his expression neutral, but his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail. My grandfather's lawyer, James Morrison, was a man in his late 60s who had known my grandparents for over 30 years. I'd met him several times at family gatherings back when such things still happened, back before Sharon decided that her parents were nothing more than an ATM machine with annoying opinions. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Morrison began, placing a thick document on the table. "The last will and testament of Arthur Morgan is straightforward, though I suspect not everyone will find its contents agreeable." Sharon leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. I noticed she'd grabbed Rick's hand, squeezing it in anticipation. They looked like children on Christmas morning, absolutely certain that the biggest present under the tree had their name on it. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and began to read, his voice steady and professional. The preliminaries were standard, the legal language dense but clear. Then came the part that mattered. "To my daughter Sharon, I leave the sum of $1, and my hopes that someday she will understand that love cannot be measured in money, though she has spent most of her life trying to prove otherwise." Sharon's intake of breath was so sharp it sounded like a hiss. Rick's face began to redden. But Mr. Morrison continued without pause. "To my granddaughter Ava Marie Callahan, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to my home and all its contents, at 47 Maple Grove Drive. My investment portfolio currently valued at approximately $2.7 million. My personal effects and any other assets not specifically designated elsewhere in this document." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. My hands began to shake and I had to clasp them together under the table. $2.7 million. The house. Everything. I'd expected maybe a small bequest, perhaps some of Grandma Eleanor's jewelry, something sentimental. Not this, never this. Sharon exploded. There's no other word for it. She shot to her feet so violently, her chair toppled backward, slamming her palms on the mahogany table hard enough to make everyone jump. "This is insane. He was senile. She manipulated him." Sharon's voice climbed higher with each word, spittle flying from her lips. "That conniving little bitch brainwashed him. I'm his daughter, everything should be mine." Mr. Morrison remained calm, though I saw his jaw tighten. "Mrs. Brennan, I assure you that your father was of completely sound mind when this will was drafted and signed. In fact, he specifically anticipated this reaction and left detailed documentation of his decision-making process." Rick had finally found his voice. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face now purple with rage. "You're not getting a single cent. You hear me? Not one goddamn cent. We'll fight this. We'll bury you in legal fees until you beg us to settle." Marcus Thorne finally spoke, his voice a stark contrast to his client's hysteria. It was smooth, controlled, almost pleasant. "Mr. Morrison, I'm sure you can understand my client's distress. This is highly unusual, to say the least. We will of course be contesting this will. There are clear grounds for undue influence." He reached into his briefcase and placed a crisp business card on the table, sliding it across the polished surface toward me. "Ms. Callahan, I suggest you retain counsel. We'll be seeing you in court." The professional mask had slipped just enough for me to see what lay beneath. This wasn't personal to him. It was just business. Messy, lucrative business. As I left the law office that day, my mind was reeling. I walked through Boston's financial district in a daze, barely seeing the crowds of people rushing past. My grandfather had left me everything. But more than that, he'd essentially disowned Sharon, his only child. The pain that must have gone into that decision, the disappointment he must have felt. And I'd never known the full extent of it, never understood just how badly Sharon had hurt him over the years. I should have. The signs had been there all along. That night I sat in my small apartment, a one-bedroom place in Somerville, that I'd scrimped and saved to afford, and I forced myself to remember. To really remember, not the sanitized version I'd been telling myself for years, but the truth. I was 7 years old when my father left. One day he was there, the next he wasn't, and Sharon's explanation was simple. He didn't love us enough to stay. For years, I believed that. I believed I was somehow unlovable, that I'd failed to be good enough to make him stay. Only much later did I learn the truth from Grandpa Arthur during one of our late-night talks on his porch. My father had wanted custody. He'd fought for me. But Sharon had lied, manipulated, and weaponized me to extract a settlement. He'd been pushed out, and when he'd tried to maintain contact, Sharon made it impossible, turning every visit into a battlefield until he finally tragically gave up. He died in a car accident when I was 12, and I'd gone to his funeral as a stranger, mourning a man I barely remembered. Sharon had remarried quickly after the divorce. Husband number 2 was a businessman who seemed stable, seemed kind. That marriage lasted 2 years before Sharon's gambling problem and compulsive shopping destroyed it. I was 9, then old enough to remember the screaming matches, the way Sharon would max out credit cards and then cry about being a victim when the bills came due. Rick was husband number 3, and by the time he appeared I was 13, and already learning to make myself small and invisible. He drank, he gambled, and he had a way of looking at my mother's assets, including her parents' generosity, as if they were his personal piggy bank. But Sharon didn't seem to mind as long as he told her she was beautiful and didn't question her spending. It was around that time that I started spending more and more time with my grandparents. Grandpa Arthur and Grandma Eleanor lived in a beautiful, old Victorian house in Newton, a Boston suburb, that felt like stepping into a different world. Their home was filled with books, with music, with the smell of Grandma's cooking, and the sound of Grandpa's laughter. It was everything my mother's house wasn't: stable, peaceful, safe. "You can always come here, sweetheart," Grandma Eleanor told me one evening when I was 14, after Sharon had forgotten to pick me up from a school event for the 3rd time that month. "This is your home too, always." And so it became my real home. I spent weekends there, holidays, summers. When I needed a quiet place to study, when I had a piano recital or a basketball game, when I just needed to feel like someone cared about me, I went to Grandpa and Grandma. They attended every event, cheered at every game, beamed with pride at every achievement. They helped me with college applications, celebrated when I got into Boston University, supported me through law school. Sharon showed up to exactly 2 events in my entire childhood. My 8th grade graduation, because her father had threatened to stop sending her money if she didn't, and my college graduation, where she spent the entire time complaining about the heat and left before the ceremony ended. I didn't fully understand the financial aspect until later. I was going through old papers in Grandpa's study one evening during college, looking for a document he'd asked me to find, when I stumbled upon a ledger. It was detailed, meticulous, written in Grandpa's precise handwriting. Page after page of entries dating back over 2 decades. Sharon, $2,500 for Rick's business opportunity. Sharon, $2,500, roof repair note. This is the 5th roof repair in 3 years. Sharon, $2,500, emergency medical expenses called hospital, no record of any emergency. On and on it went. 22 years of monthly payments, each one accompanied by whatever excuse Sharon had invented that month. Over $500,000 given freely by parents who loved their daughter and wanted to help, even as that daughter systematically destroyed every opportunity and blamed them for her failures. The ledger stopped 7 months before I found it. The final entry read simply, "Told Sharon no more. She called me a selfish bastard and hasn't spoken to me since." I'd been so absorbed in my studies, so focused on building my own life, that I hadn't noticed the rift between my mother and grandparents had become a chasm. Or maybe I'd noticed and been grateful for it, grateful that Sharon's chaos couldn't touch the one stable part of my world. Grandma Eleanor died of cancer when I was in my 2nd year of law school. It was sudden, aggressive, and devastating. At her funeral, Sharon showed up in a black dress that was more appropriate for a cocktail party than a memorial service. She cried, theatrically accepted condolences from people she didn't know, and then cornered Grandpa Arthur to ask about the will at his wife's funeral before Eleanor was even in the ground. I wanted to scream at her. Instead, I held Grandpa's hand and helped him through the day, and I pretended not to hear Sharon telling Rick that the old man must be worth at least $3 million, and now there's no one to split it with. After Grandma died, Grandpa Arthur seemed to age overnight, but his mind remained sharp, his sense of justice undiminished. He'd been a judge for over 30 years, known for his fairness and his unwavering commitment to the law. He taught me that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, but about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "You're going to be a great lawyer, Ava," he told me one evening about a year before he died. We were sitting on his porch, watching the sun set, something we'd done hundreds of times. "But more than that, you're going to be a good person. You already are. You didn't learn that from Sharon, God knows, but somehow, despite everything she put you through, you turned out kind and strong and true." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. "I need you to know something, sweetheart. I've made arrangements for when I'm gone. Sharon won't like them, but they're the right thing to do. I've thought about it for years, prayed about it, consulted with lawyers and friends and my own conscience, and I'm at peace with my decision." I should have pressed him for details. I should have understood what he was trying to tell me, but I was young and naive, and the idea of losing him was too painful to contemplate seriously. So I just squeezed his hand and changed the subject. 2 months before Grandpa's death, I accepted a position as an assistant district attorney in Boston. I'd worked my way through law school, graduated near the top of my class, and spent 2 years as a public defender before making the switch to prosecution. I specialized in domestic violence cases in helping people escape from situations that were destroying them from the inside out. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping strangers escape from toxic family situations while remaining chained to my own. Grandpa was so proud. He threw a small celebration dinner, invited my closest friends, gave a toast that made me cry happy tears. Sharon didn't come. She didn't even call. When Grandpa died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning, Sharon's first words to me weren't about grief or loss. They were, "Did he say anything about me at the end about his will?" I hung up on her. It was the first time I'd ever done that, and it felt both terrible and liberating. Now sitting in my apartment with the knowledge of his will, I finally understood. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was Grandpa's final judgment, his final statement. This was his way of saying blood doesn't excuse betrayal and genetics don't create family. Love does, choice does, showing up does. Sharon and Rick didn't wait long to escalate. The lawsuit was filed within a week, but that was just the beginning. Sharon launched a media campaign that would have been impressive if it wasn't so vicious. She somehow got a local news station to do an interview, and I watched in horrified fascination as my mother transformed into a tragic victim. Sitting on a taupe couch in some studio, wearing a simple dress and minimal makeup that made her look vulnerable rather than vain, Sharon cried on cue for the cameras. Her performance was worthy of an Oscar. "I dedicated my life to my father," she said, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. "After my mother died, I was there for him every single day." This was a lie so blatant, I actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment. Sharon had visited Grandpa exactly twice in the 2 years after Grandma died, and both times she'd left early, claiming she had somewhere more important to be. But the cameras loved her. The interviewer, a sympathetic woman in her 40s, handed Sharon tissues and made understanding noises as my mother continued. "And now my daughter, who I raised alone after her father abandoned us, who I sacrificed everything for, has turned him against me. She's a prosecutor. She knows exactly how to manipulate legal documents, how to influence vulnerable people. My father was 84 years old. She took advantage of an old man who was grieving his wife, and now she's stealing the inheritance that should support me in my old age." The story went viral in the local Boston area. Suddenly, I couldn't go to the courthouse, couldn't grab coffee, couldn't walk down the street without people staring, whispering, or occasionally confronting me directly. "You should be ashamed," an elderly woman told me in the grocery store, her voice dripping with disgust. "Taking money from your own mother." My supervisor at the DA's office called me in for a meeting. Richard Chen was a good man, a fair man, but he looked uncomfortable as I sat across from him in his office. "Ava, I think you're one of our best prosecutors," he began, and I felt my stomach drop because nothing good ever came after a statement like that. "But I've been getting calls from the media, from city councilors, even from the mayor's office. This situation with your family is creating a perception problem." "A perception problem," I repeated, my voice flat. "Look, I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying you did anything wrong. But optics matter in this job. The DA needs the public to trust us, to see us as above reproach. When one of our prosecutors is embroiled in a very public inheritance dispute, being accused of elder abuse and manipulation," he trailed off, spreading his hands helplessly. "So you want me to step down?" "No." He looked genuinely shocked. "God, no, you're too valuable, and besides that would make it look like we think you did something wrong. But I do need you to be careful, very careful. Don't talk to the media, don't engage with any of this publicly, and for God's sake, don't do anything that could be perceived as using your position for personal advantage." I left his office feeling like the walls were closing in. Sharon wasn't just coming for the money, she was coming for my entire life, my career, everything I'd built for myself. And she was doing it with Marcus Thorne's expert guidance. Then came the complaint to the Bar Association. I opened the thick envelope from the Board of Bar Overseers, with shaking hands, scanning the formal legal language until I found the core accusation. Utilizing her position as an assistant district attorney and her specialized legal knowledge to exert undue influence over Arthur Morgan, a vulnerable elderly man for the purpose of personal financial gain. If they found the complaint credible enough to investigate seriously, even if I was ultimately cleared, the cloud of suspicion could follow me for years. It could cost me promotions opportunities, maybe even my current position. I needed help. I needed someone who understood this world, who could fight Sharon and Marcus Thorne on their own terms. I needed a lawyer who was as good as Marcus, but who actually gave a damn about truth and justice, rather than just winning. I found Ben Carter through a recommendation from a judge I trusted. He was in his early 50s, a former prosecutor turned defense attorney who'd made a name for himself handling complex civil litigation. His office was nothing like Morrison's fancy downtown suite. It was a modest space in Cambridge, with bookshelves overflowing with legal texts and a coffee maker that looked like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. "Tell me everything," Ben said after his assistant brought us both coffee in mugs that didn't match. "And I mean everything, Ava. The stuff that makes you look bad, the stuff that's embarrassing, the stuff you'd rather forget. I can't help you if I'm surprised in court." So I told him. All of it. The abandonment, the neglect, the years of watching my grandparents essentially support my mother while she blamed them for all her failures. The ledger, the death threats that had started after the will was read, the brick through my car window. Ben listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied me with sharp blue eyes. "Your mother is a piece of work," he said finally, "and Marcus Thorne is a shark. But here's the thing, Ava. They've overplayed their hand. The bar complaint is baseless, and he knows it. They're hoping you'll panic and settle just to make it all go away. The media campaign is designed to isolate you, to make you feel like you're alone, and everyone thinks you're a monster, but you're not alone, and we're going to prove that they're the ones who should be ashamed." He pulled out a legal pad and started making lists. "We need witnesses, people who saw Sharon's relationship with your grandfather, who can testify to his mental state, who can speak to your character. We need documentation of Sharon's financial exploitation. And we need to flip the narrative. Right now, she's the poor victimized mother. We're going to show the world who she really is." Over the next month, Ben and I worked tirelessly. He tracked down people I hadn't thought about in years. Edward Hayes, the groundskeeper who'd worked for my grandparents for 20 years and who'd witnessed countless visits where Sharon showed up demanding money. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who'd been there when Sharon had screamed at Grandpa for wasting money on my college textbooks. Dr. Phillips' grandpa's doctor, who could testify that Arthur had been of completely sound mind right up until his death, sharp as a tack, and utterly clear about his wishes. I dug through years of emails and text messages between me and my grandparents. The picture they painted was stark, a loving, consistent relationship between a grandfather and granddaughter full of mundane details about daily life homework, helped discussions of cases I was working on, his pride in my achievements. And in contrast, the emails from Sharon sporadic, always asking for something often accusatory if the request was denied. One email exchange in particular stood out. Sharon had written, "I can't believe you're paying for Ava's law school, but you won't help me with Rick's legal fees. What kind of father chooses a grandchild over his own daughter? You must really hate me." Grandpa's response had been measured but firm. "I'm investing in Ava's future because she's investing in herself. She works hard, she's responsible, and she appreciates the opportunities she's given. I will always help you in a genuine emergency, Sharon, but Rick's DUI is a consequence of his own choices, and bailing him out teaches neither of you anything. This isn't about hate. It's about helping you both learn to stand on your own feet." Sharon had responded, "Fine, don't ever expect to hear from me again." That had been 3 years before Grandma died. And true to her word, Sharon had barely spoken to either of her parents during that time, except when she needed money. But the most damaging evidence came from Grandpa himself. Ben had a hunch and asked if Grandpa had been the type to document things carefully. I remembered the ledger, remembered his meticulous nature as a judge, and suggested we check if there were any other records. We found them in a safe deposit box that I'd inherited along with everything else. Inside was a thick folder labeled Sharon in case of disputes. Inside that folder was a comprehensive record of their relationship, copies of checks written to her receipts, showing the purchases she'd claimed were emergencies, but were actually luxury goods, emails where she threatened to cut him out of her life if he didn't give her money, even recordings of voicemail messages. In one particularly painful recording, Sharon's voice slurred with what was clearly alcohol or pills or both, saying, "You think you're so much better than me sitting in your fancy house judging me? Well, I'm your daughter. You're supposed to love me unconditionally. But no, you love your perfect granddaughter more. Fine. When you're dying in some nursing home, don't expect me to visit. I'll be too busy spending the inheritance you're too selfish to give me now." Ben listened to that recording 3 times, his expression growing darker each time. "Juries," he said quietly, "don't like this at all." But perhaps the most powerful evidence was found by accident. I'd returned to Grandpa's house for the first time since his death, needing to start the painful process of sorting through his belongings. The house felt empty in a way that made my chest ache. I walked through rooms full of memories, touching furniture that suddenly felt sacred because he'd touched it, running my fingers along the spines of books he'd loved. In his study in the closet where he kept old case files from his years as a judge, I found a cardboard box that was heavier than it looked. Inside were VHS tapes labeled in Grandma's handwriting: Ava, piano recital, age 10. Ava, basketball championship, age 14. Ava, high school graduation, and dozens more. I found an old VCR in the basement and hooked it up to the TV. Then I sat down and watched my childhood unfold in grainy footage. The camera work was shaky. Grandma had been filming, but the content was clear. There I was at age 8, nervous in my piano recital dress, searching the audience for my family. The camera panned across the auditorium, and there in the very front row were 2 seats marked with handwritten signs, reserved for Ava's parents. The seats were empty. They were empty in every single video. In the basketball championship video, you could hear Grandpa's voice cheering as I made a shot, and Grandma saying to someone off camera, "Sharon said she'd try to make it, but I'm not holding my breath." She hadn't made it. She never made it. The high school graduation video was perhaps the most damning. The camera caught me walking across the stage to receive my diploma, graduating with honors, and then panned to where Grandpa and Grandma sat beaming with pride. Several rows behind them, I could see Sharon, but only briefly. She was looking at her phone, clearly bored. When Rick leaned over to whisper something to her, they both laughed, and then they got up and left. On the video, you could hear Grandma's soft, sad voice. "There they go. Can't even stay for the whole ceremony." These videos were more than evidence. They were a visual record of my entire childhood, a chronicle of absence and abandonment so complete that it was undeniable. No jury in the world could watch these and think I was the one who'd manipulated anything. As the court date approached, Sharon and Rick grew more desperate. The media campaign had backfired somewhat when an investigative journalist actually looked into the facts and wrote a piece questioning Sharon's narrative. Marcus Thorne began pushing hard for a settlement, which told me he knew his case was weak. But Rick had another problem. His gambling debts had reached critical mass, and he'd made the catastrophic mistake of borrowing from people who don't take "I'll pay you back when I get the inheritance" as a valid payment plan. That's when Manny Gallo entered the picture. I first saw him outside my apartment building, a brick of a man in an expensive suit, flanked by 2 others who looked like they bench-pressed cars for fun. They didn't approach me, didn't threaten me directly. They just stood there watching, making their presence known. The next day, I found a business card under my windshield wiper. Gallo and Associates Financial Consulting. The message was clear: Rick owed money, and they knew I was about to inherit $2.7 million. They were letting me know I was now involved whether I wanted to be or not. When the brick came through my window that Tuesday night with Rick lurking in the background, I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. This had become dangerous. I reported it to the police, of course. Filed a report, handed over the note, even pointed out the security cameras in the parking garage. But I knew how these things went. Unless they caught someone red-handed, unless there was overwhelming evidence, it would go nowhere. People like Manny Gallo didn't get caught for small-time intimidation. Ben wanted me to go to the judge to file for a restraining order to make this part of the case, but I refused. If I showed fear, if I let Sharon and Rick know they could intimidate me, they'd never stop. Instead, I bought pepper spray, varied my routines, and kept going. The breaking point came not in court, but at the cemetery. I'd gone to visit my grandparents' graves on what would have been their 60th wedding anniversary. It was a cold morning in early November, the kind where your breath fogs in front of you and the sky is the color of old steel. I brought flowers, 2 bouquets of yellow roses, because those had been Grandma's favorites. I was kneeling by their headstones arranging the flowers when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could feel her presence, could sense the anger radiating off her like heat. Having a nice chat with them. Sharon's voice was bitter, caustic. Telling them more lies about me. I stood slowly, brushed the dirt off my knees, and turned to face her. She looked terrible. The expensive clothes couldn't hide the toll that stress and possibly alcohol was taking. Her face was puffy, her eyes bloodshot, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm not the one who lied," I said quietly. "I never was. Everything you have is because of me." The words exploded out of her like they'd been building pressure for weeks. "I gave birth to you, I raised you. Every opportunity you got, every advantage, it was because I was your mother." The delusion was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I could only stare at her. Then something inside me, something that had been cracking for years, finally broke clean through. "You didn't raise me, Sharon." I used her first name deliberately, watching her flinch. "Grandpa and Grandma raised me. They fed me, housed me, loved me. They showed up to every event, celebrated every achievement, wiped away every tear. You were barely there. And when you were, you made it clear I was an obligation at best and an inconvenience at worst." "That's not true. I loved you." "Love isn't a word, Sharon. It's an action. It's showing up. It's sacrifice. It's putting someone else's needs before your own wants. You don't know what love means." She moved faster than I expected, closing the distance between us and slapping me hard across the face. The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed across the cemetery. It stung, but not as much as it would have years ago. Not as much as all the time she'd hurt me without laying a hand on me. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you stand there and judge me? I'm your mother." I reached up and grabbed her wrist before she could hit me again. My grip was firm, unyielding, and I saw surprise flash across her face. The little girl she'd bullied and manipulated was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned to fight back. "No," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You're the woman who gave birth to me. That's all. Grandma Eleanor was my mother in every way that matters, and you're not going to touch me ever again." I released her wrist and turned back to the graves, picking up the bouquet that had fallen during the confrontation. I carefully rearranged the roses, taking my time, making it clear that I was dismissing her. When I finally looked up, she was still standing there, tears streaming down her face, looking lost and old and pathetic. "They never loved me," she said, her voice small and broken. "They only ever loved you." For just a second, I felt something like pity. Then I remembered the ledger, the recordings, the years of manipulation and exploitation. I remembered Grandpa's tired voice in that recording. "I will always love you, Sharon, but I don't like who you've become, and I won't enable your self-destruction anymore." "They did love you," I said. "They loved you enough to try to help you to keep trying even after you'd hurt them over and over. But you mistook their boundaries for rejection, and you chose money over relationship every single time. Don't rewrite history now that they're not here to defend themselves." I walked away, then left her standing there among the graves. I didn't look back. The trial began on a Monday in late November. The courthouse was packed with reporters lining the hallway outside the courtroom and spectators filling every available seat. Sharon's media campaign had ensured that everyone in Boston knew about this case, but what she hadn't counted on was that public opinion had begun to shift. Marcus Thorne was in his element, I had to admit. He was smooth, confident, presenting his case with the skill of someone who'd done this dozens of times. He called witnesses who testified that Grandpa had seemed confused in his final years, though under cross-examination they all admitted they'd barely spoken to him. He presented expert testimony from a geriatric psychiatrist who'd never actually examined Grandpa, but was willing to opine that any 84-year-old who disinherited his only child must have been suffering from diminished capacity. Sharon testified, and her performance was masterful. She cried at all the right moments, spoke in a trembling voice about her childhood, about how close she'd been to her father, before Ava drove a wedge between us. She painted herself as a devoted daughter who'd been betrayed by her own child. Then it was our turn. Ben called witness after witness, who systematically dismantled Sharon's narrative. Edward, the groundskeeper, testified about the dozens of times Sharon had shown up, demanding money, about the raised voices and slammed doors. Mrs. Chen, her English heavily accented, but her message clear, described Sharon's verbal abuse of her father, the times she'd called him selfish and cruel for not giving her more money. Dr. Phillips brought medical records showing Grandpa had been in excellent mental health, sharp and clear-minded right up until the heart attack that killed him. A neurologist who'd examined him 6 months before his death testified that his cognitive function was better than most 60-year-olds. But the most powerful witness was Judge Harold Warren, retired, who'd been Grandpa's best friend for over 40 years. He was 86 years old, walked with a cane, and spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime in courtrooms. I spoke with Arthur the week before he died. Judge Warren testified, his voice strong despite his age. We had lunch at our club as we did every month. He was more lucid than I am. We discussed legal precedents, current cases, even did the crossword puzzle together. He was sharp as a tack. He paused, then added, "We also talked about his will, about Sharon." Arthur was heartbroken about his relationship with his daughter, but he had no illusions about who she'd become. He told me, "Harold, I love her, but I can't reward bad behavior anymore. Ava is my legacy. She's the one who inherited Eleanor's kindness and my sense of justice. The money should go where it'll do some good, not where it'll be gambled away or used to buy things Sharon doesn't need to impress people she doesn't like." The courtroom was silent. Even Marcus Thorne had no questions for Judge Warren. What could he ask? How do you cross-examine someone with that much credibility, that much integrity? Then Ben entered the ledger into evidence. All 22 years of it. $660,000 documented with precision. Sharon's face went white as the pages were projected onto a screen for the jury to see. Entry after entry, excuse after excuse, each one revealed as either an exaggeration or an outright lie. The emails came next. The threats, the manipulation, the emotional blackmail. "You care more about Ava than your own daughter. If you loved me, you'd help me. I guess I don't matter to you anymore." And then Ben plays the voicemail. Sharon's drunken voice, slurred and vicious, echoing through the courtroom. "I'll be too busy spending the inheritance you're too selfish to give me now." I watched Sharon's face crumble. This wasn't part of the narrative she'd been telling herself, the story where she was the victim. This was the truth recorded in her own voice, undeniable and damning. But Ben wasn't done. He set up a television and VCR on a rolling cart, and he played excerpts from the videos. The empty seats repeated year after year. My face searching the crowd, the disappointment visible even through the grainy footage when I realized they weren't there. Grandma's quiet, sad commentary. The high school graduation video, where Sharon and Rick literally walked out before the ceremony ended. Several jurors were crying. The judge himself looked moved, his professional detachment slipping just enough for his humanity to show through. Then Ben called me to the stand. I'd testified hundreds of times as a prosecutor, but this was different. This was personal, raw, vulnerable. Ben led me through my childhood, through the years of abandonment and disappointment, through the countless times my grandparents had stepped in where Sharon had stepped out. "Did you ever manipulate your grandfather?" Ben asked. "No, I loved him. I spent time with him because I wanted to, not because I wanted anything from him. I had no idea he was going to leave me his estate. I expected maybe some keepsakes, some jewelry of my grandmother's. That would have been more than enough. What would you have done if you'd known about the will before he died?" I considered this carefully. I would have asked him to reconsider, not because I didn't want the responsibility, but because I know how much he loved Sharon despite everything. I would have tried to find a way to structure it differently, maybe a trust with conditions, something that could have helped her without enabling her. I never wanted to be the cause of conflict in this family. "But you are not the cause, are you?" "No," I said firmly. "The cause is years of choices Sharon made. The cause is putting money before relationships, greed before gratitude. I'm just the excuse she's using now to avoid taking responsibility for those choices." Marcus Thorne's cross-examination was aggressive, but I'd been trained by some of the best prosecutors in Boston. I stayed calm, answered clearly. Never rose to his bait. He tried to paint me as calculating, as someone who'd strategically cultivated a relationship with wealthy grandparents for financial gain. "Isn't it true that you spent increasingly more time with your grandparents as you got older?" he asked, his tone insinuating. "Yes, because my mother spent increasingly less time caring where I was or what I was doing, because I needed stability and love, and they provided both. Children don't love people strategically, Mr. Thorne. They love people who show up for them." He had no response to that. The closing arguments took most of a day. Marcus Thorne painted a picture of undue influence of a clever young woman who'd used her legal knowledge and her position to manipulate an elderly man. He appealed to the jury's sense of fairness, arguing that a daughter shouldn't be disinherited completely. Ben's closing was simpler and more powerful. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, building an undeniable case. Then he said something I'll never forget. "This case isn't about money, it's about honoring the wishes of a man who spent his life serving justice. Arthur Morgan was a judge. He understood the law better than anyone in this courtroom. He knew exactly what he was doing when he made his will. He made a choice based on a lifetime of experience with both his daughter and his granddaughter. Sharon Brennan wants you to believe she's the victim here. But the real victim is Arthur Morgan, whose final wishes are being disrespected by the very person who caused him the most pain during his life. The real victim is Ava Callahan, who is being punished for doing nothing more than loving her grandparents and being loved in return. Don't let greed masquerading as hurt feelings override a good man's final act of justice. But Ben had saved one more piece of evidence for last. He requested permission to play an audio recording that had been discovered in Grandpa's safe deposit box. The judge allowed it. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as the tape began to play. There was a moment of static, then Grandpa's voice, strong and clear and unmistakably him, filled the room. My name is Arthur James Morgan. I am 84 years old, and I am recording this on March 15th, 2023, in the presence of my attorney, James Morrison, and my physician, Dr. Robert Phillips, both of whom can attest to my mental competency and the voluntary nature of this statement. There was a pause, the sound of Grandpa taking a breath, gathering his thoughts. If this recording is being played, it means that my will has been challenged almost certainly by my daughter Sharon. I want to make my intentions absolutely clear, not just for legal purposes, but because I hope that someday, maybe when she's older and has had time to reflect, Sharon will understand why I made the choices I did. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with emotion but remained steady. I love my daughter. I have always loved my daughter. But love does not mean enabling destructive behavior. For over 20 years, I gave Sharon money whenever she asked, believing that as her father, it was my duty to help. But I came to realize that I wasn't helping her. I was funding her gambling, her irresponsible spending, her refusal to live within her means. Every dollar I gave her taught her that there would always be someone to bail her out, that she never had to face the consequences of her choices. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear people breathing. More painfully, Sharon made a choice to prioritize money over family. She showed up for holidays when she needed money and disappeared when she didn't. She missed countless important moments in her daughter's life. When Ava graduated high school with honors, Sharon left before the ceremony ended because she was bored. When Ava made the dean's list in college, Sharon's only response was to ask me why I was paying for Ava's education instead of funding her husband's latest failed business venture. I felt tears sliding down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. Ava is not perfect. No one is. But Ava showed up. She called her grandmother every Sunday, even when she was drowning in law school work. She spent her spring breaks helping me clean out the garage instead of going to Florida with her friends. She held her grandmother's hand during chemotherapy. She grieved with me when Eleanor died. She chose us again and again, not because we were wealthy, but because we loved each other. Grandpa's voice grew firmer, taking on the tone he'd used when delivering judgments from the bench. The law recognizes both blood ties and the ties of choice. I recognize both as well. Sharon is my daughter by blood, and I have left her $1 as the law requires to show she has not been forgotten. But Ava is my daughter by choice, by love, by every measure that truly matters. She is my legacy, my greatest achievement, the proof that Eleanor and I did something right in this world. The money, the house, everything I've accumulated is meant to support her, to give her the same security and opportunities that she gave us through her love and presence. There was the sound of paper rustling, then Grandpa's voice one last time. Sharon, if you're hearing this, know that I loved you until my last breath. But I could not reward the choices you made, the pain you caused, the opportunities you squandered. I hope someday you understand that this wasn't punishment. It was my final attempt to teach you the lesson you've refused to learn your entire adult life, that love is not about what you can get from people. It's about what you give to them. The recording ended. The silence that followed was profound. Sharon had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Rick sat next to her, staring at the floor, looking like he wanted to disappear. Marcus Thorne, for the first time since I'd met him, looked uncomfortable, like he regretted taking this case. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict with a clear, firm voice. We find in favor of the defendant Ava Callahan and uphold the will of Arthur Morgan as written. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked at Sharon and Rick with something close to contempt. I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case. Judge Reynolds said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. It is clear to me that this lawsuit was not filed in good faith. It was a calculated attempt to overturn the valid wishes of a competent man through manipulation of public opinion and abuse of the legal process. He turned to Marcus Thorne. Mr. Thorne, I am deeply disappointed in your conduct throughout this trial. You took a case that had no legal merit and used every trick in the book to drag a grieving woman through the mud. I am referring this matter to the Board of Bar Overseers for review of potential ethical violations. Marcus Thorne's face went pale. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering the plaintiffs Sharon Brennan and Richard Brennan to pay all court costs for both sides. Additionally, I am awarding Ms. Callahan $50,000 in sanctions to compensate her for the emotional distress and reputational harm caused by this frivolous lawsuit. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like justice itself. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Reporters swarmed cameras, flashed, people shouted questions. Sharon tried to make a statement, but it devolved into incoherent sobbing and accusations. No one was listening anymore. The truth had come out, and all her carefully crafted lies had been exposed. Then I saw them. Manny Gallo and his two associates standing at the edge of the crowd. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at Rick, and the expression on Manny's face was not friendly. Rick saw them too. The color drained from his face. He grabbed Sharon's arm, trying to hurry her toward their car, but Manny was faster. He and his men moved through the crowd like sharks through water, cutting off their escape. We need to talk, Rick, I heard Manny say, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable threat. About that money you owe me. Since the court thing didn't work out, I could have felt satisfaction at that moment. I could have stood there and watched karma catch up with them. But I felt nothing, just a vast, peaceful emptiness where all the anger and hurt used to live. I turned away from the chaos and walked to where Ben was waiting by his car. You did it, he said, smiling. We did it, I corrected, then added, thank you for believing me, for fighting for me. You made it easy, he said. You were telling the truth. That always makes a lawyer's job simpler. As I drove home that evening, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Free from the weight of obligation to people who'd never really cared about me. Free from the hope that someday Sharon would love me the way I'd always wanted to be loved. Free from the little girl inside me who kept waiting for her mother to show up. That night I sat in my apartment and made a list. Not of things I wanted to buy or places I wanted to go with my inheritance, but of things I wanted to do, ways I wanted to honor Grandpa and Grandma's memory, ways to turn their gift into something that mattered. 1 year later, I stood in front of a beautiful brick building in downtown Boston. The sign above the door read, The Morgan Legacy Foundation, Empowering Grandparent-Raised Youth. I'd used almost all of the inheritance to establish it. The foundation provided scholarships, mentoring, counseling, and support for kids who were being raised by their grandparents who'd been abandoned or neglected by their parents. Kids like me, kids who needed someone to show them they mattered, that they were valued, that their situation didn't define their future. The opening ceremony was packed with people who'd believed in the vision, former professors, fellow lawyers, judges, social workers, and most importantly, dozens of kids and their grandparents who would benefit from the programs we'd created. I gave a short speech talking about Grandpa and Grandma, about the difference they'd made in my life, about how their love had been my salvation. I didn't mention Sharon. She was no longer part of my story, no longer someone I needed to think about or factor into my decisions. 6 months after that, I received news that I'd been nominated for a judgeship. At 32, I would be one of the youngest people ever appointed to the bench in Boston. The recommendation had come from multiple sources, including several judges who'd known Grandpa, who said I embodied the same commitment to justice and integrity that he had. The day I was sworn in, I stood in the same courthouse where I'd fought for my inheritance, wearing the black robe that symbolized justice and fairness. I thought about Grandpa, about all those conversations on his porch, about the way he'd taught me that the law was about more than rules and precedents. It was about people, about protecting the vulnerable, about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I thought about Sharon too briefly. I'd heard through the grapevine that she and Rick had divorced, that she'd declared bankruptcy, that she'd moved out of state. I felt nothing but a vague sense of sadness for the life she could have had if she'd made different choices. But mostly I thought about the future, about all the cases I would hear, all the people I would serve, all the ways I could carry on Grandpa's legacy. In my chambers, I kept 3 photographs, one of Grandpa and Grandma on their wedding day, one of the 3 of us at my law school graduation, and one from the Morgan Legacy Foundation opening ceremony, showing a young girl hugging her grandmother with pure joy on both their faces. These were my family, not the people who shared my DNA, but abandoned me, The people who chose me, who showed up, who loved me unconditionally, and taught me how to love myself. I learned that family is not about blood or obligation. It's about choice and commitment. It's about showing up day after day, even when it's hard. It's about the life you build, not the life you're born into. And I learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money or property. It's the example of how to live with integrity, how to love without conditions, and how to choose justice and kindness, even when the world gives you every reason not to. Grandpa left me $2.7 million, but his real gift was so much more valuable. He showed me who I could become. That's the legacy worth fighting for. That's the inheritance I'll pass on. The truth is, we all have a choice in this life. We can be defined by the people who hurt us, or we can be defined by how we choose to heal. We can let toxic relationships destroy us, or we can have the courage to walk away and build something better. We can wait forever for people to change and give us the love we deserve, or we can recognize that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to stop waiting. I chose healing. I chose to walk away. I chose to honor the people who truly loved me by living a life they would be proud of. And you have that choice too, no matter what your situation is. No matter how impossible it seems to break free. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You are not required to sacrifice your peace, your sanity, or your future for people who wouldn't do the same for you. Your life is yours to live. Your story is yours to write. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is close a chapter that no longer serves you and start a new one. So here's my question for you. What chapter do you need to close? What toxic relationship or situation are you tolerating that you know deep down is destroying you? And more importantly, what would your life look like if you finally had the courage to walk away? Think about it. Then tell me in the comments. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or inspiration or just made you feel less alone, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss future stories of people who found the strength to choose themselves. Because that's what this is all about, choosing yourself over and over until it becomes natural. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember, you deserve so much better than you're settling for. Don't wait for permission to claim it.